Welcome everyone to episode 27 of Somebody Asked Me with Janice Case. This week, we are continuing to dive deep into our conversation around how to be an anti-racist and hoping, of course, to bring you some clarity around the key concepts from our lenses. And so, of course, I'm joined today again by the fantastic Melissa Ellis and Henri Williams. We already did our good mornings before I press record, so I'm not going to repeat those. Next week, I'll press record earlier. But it's great to have you both back. And I, of course, so value that you're contributing to the conversation. I'm going to quickly take us back to last week before we kick off this week's conversation. And our listeners hopefully will recall that we explored the concepts of dueling consciousness as well as the concepts of anti-racism, assimilationist, and segregationist. In doing so, we realized a few things, a lot of things, but not the least of which for me is that words matter and that good intentions can be laced with really hurtful roots, if you will. We also explored the origins of power in terms of race. And yeah, it was just kind of jam-packed. So at the end of the episode, we did charge our listeners with making the learning actionable, and we offered a few ways to do that. We talked about things like day-to-day check yourself, catch yourself thinking, racist thoughts like, okay, why is that person behaving that way? Or why are they letting their kids do that? That was an example Melissa gave us, etc. So checking yourself and asking yourself when those things come into your head, checking yourself and asking yourself, whoa, wait a second, where did that come from, right? What is that based in? That's a deliberate way of starting to change your own thinking. Also, we said if you're connected to a school or a church or a community organization, you are impacted by policies. And so start to be aware of them, start to question them. And of course, we also said talk to somebody in your life, like take the small step of talking to somebody in your life that you wouldn't necessarily talk with, right? And seek to understand them. So of course, we would love to hear about the little ways and the big ways that you might be taking these conversations and making them actionable. And to do that, you can follow us on our Facebook page and post right there. So today, then, we're going to dig into the concepts of biological racist and biological anti-racist. Our author that we're exploring, Ibram Kendi, couches these concepts in the story of his third grade self, which is, I just love how he's kind of attaching all of this to his own experience. And in the case of this particular chapter, he talks about his experience in a local public school and a classroom full of mostly brown kids and just, I think, 2 or 3 white kids and 1 white teacher. And he starts with a story that can that grabbed me right out of the gate because it's the same story that we see happening in classrooms across the country today. And this episode's not just about education. This just happens to be the part of his story that he uses to represent the learning. And so that's what we're gonna kind of go with. But that was the thing that struck me, you guys, is that I was just reading an article and we just had a conversation with Soups Around the Country earlier this week around the suspension data disparities for kids of color in this country, and that continue to exist today. And Kendi's story really supports that. So that's kind of where we're going to focus our attention today. And I'm going to just say, let's get to it. And I'm going to go right to Henri because just as we were getting ready to get started, he was telling us a little bit about a podcast that he listened to this week and started to kind of make a connection to this idea of power here. So Henri, I know we're not going to go through the whole thing that you said a few minutes ago, but if you would pick up with kind of what the message from that podcast was and how then that led you into thinking in terms of this part of the conversation we're going to have today, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, thank you, and good morning. Well, actually, what happened, I listened to Fresh Air, and they interviewed Heather McGee, who wrote this book, The Sum of Us. And these are my words, and I certainly support people going and listening to this podcast. It's really informing. But what she did was she looked at data and pretty much quantified racism and made this and made a case for how the policies that came about that supported these racist ideas or concepts or beliefs actually did more to hurt white people than the people they were intending. And she doesn't dispute that, yes, they did hurt people of color,
Sure.
These policies. However, they also took in white people at the same time. For example, she raised this point of how, pre-civil rights, a majority of whites believed in government being supportive to the people and providing them with jobs and living wages. Post-civil rights, that percentage of people believed it, I think it was in the 60s, drops into the 30s. And she talks about how ongoingly, as policies or things in place tend to benefit the greater population, you then tend to see such rollbacks. And she talked about like college, where you were able to get grants and fellowships, and you could actually work part-time and go to college, to where now those things are gone. You have to get loans. It's costly. And she correlates this with the shift in the demographics of the people who are going to college. So it's just a great book that, talks about this thing in a quantifiable way, where she literally looks at data. Mm-hmm. And so, can you still hear me?
Yeah, we're good. Mm-hmm.
Oh, okay. So when I was listening to this podcast, I actually went and reserved the book at the library because I got to read this. But as I'm listening to her podcast, it just took me back to this book we're discussing about anti-racism, because, he makes this case for how, in various chapters, this racializing of the population has led to policies and things that continue to deny or restrict. And it's just interesting, when he talked about the Black body and, how that's manifested, and I thought about, so what are the things that we have in society that they've put in place to support and reinforce those things? And, and I thought about, even if you look at, the media, Tarzan and Jane, I mean, how were whites and blacks referenced, Amos and Andy, Father Knows Best. I mean, and I'm talking about shows that the majority of white, people watch. And this was their point of reference, but in some ways, did it do nothing more than reinforce some of these stereotypes and segregationist or integrationist ideas that we're talking about as we're going through this book?
I love that you brought it there. I am going to, just for our listeners' purposes, I'll post that episode of the podcast that you mentioned on our page, Facebook page around this podcast. And I do appreciate you making the connections that she made, like you said, around policy, because that very much is the kind of culminating focus, right, of Kendi's work is we have to understand all of these things in order to challenge the policy that exists, that without change, frankly, our belief systems can change on a day-to-day basis in our own lives. But if we don't challenge the policies that uphold all the structures that are, keeping certain groups of people at a disadvantage, then we won't see the significant change we're looking for. So I appreciate that you made that connection for her from a policy perspective. And I love the examples that you just gave and that you jumped right into. In this chapter of the book, Kendi is focused on understanding the biological nature of race, which of course we understand is a mirage. There is no biological structure to race, but he spends time on it because it is the basis for, and you just gave several examples, the misconceptions we have about how we are different as races, right? Like ultimately what we know is that there is no biological difference to race. And yet there are all of these, you use the word stereotypes, Henri, that suggest otherwise, that we've been surrounded by for our entire lives, that are common, kind of common knowledge, if you will. So Melissa, I want to bring you into the conversation and, kind of like we've done, go anywhere, right, with this chapter. There are definitely some things I'm sure each of us wants to to surface and point out, but go anywhere as far as the things that for you were important to share with our listeners to clarify their own understanding.
Absolutely. One of the things that I've been very transparent about since we started this book and these discussions is that it challenges me. Man, it challenges beliefs I've held. It challenges things I've said, done, thought, perpetuated, all of it.
Yeah.
And this chapter was no different. Let me start by saying I absolutely know that race is a social construct.
Yeah.
Know that to the core of me, believe that to the core of me, will argue that till the day I die. I know that. That does not change, however, the fact that I hold a lot of these crazy ideas because in my 50 years of life, they've been drilled into me. It's the way the world works, that I hold some of these crazy beliefs that based on biology, we are different. One of the most obvious, I think, are the physical differences.
Sure.
When you watch, for example, the NBA or the NFL, you see all of these Black men, or even in the WNBA, Black women who are extremely good at what they do. And when you see that the majority of the team is African American,
right,
it's very easy to believe that African Americans just have a built-in biological difference that makes them better at sports.
Yeah.
But it's not true. And then you see I hate to use this example, but you see a Tom Brady,
right,
who is excelling in the same sport, and you have to question, well, what is that then? If it's
right,
if it's a biological thing. And it's not until you take the time to really study the history of everything,
right,
because I think that's a thing, and it's a global thing, absolutely. But again, because we are Americans and we're speaking of our own experiences in this country, if we have a really bad habit of not remembering the history that gets us to where we are, which is probably why we are spinning our wheels and fighting the same fights that we've been fighting forever.
yeah,
Because we don't study history and we don't realize the things that have occurred. And when you study the history, all the way back to slavery specifically, you see how that has been by design. You see
right,
how it has been set up to make it seem as if Blacks are physically stronger, faster, because that justified using them in the ways that they've been used. And it justifies even today, those very examples I gave about sports, it justifies using them in the way that they're being used. It explains, when you take the time to study, why the majority of the team is Black, but the majority of the owners, all of them, are white.
right,
And it just continues to, when people, it's crazy because when people make the comparison of sports to slavery, people will say, oh, no, those guys are getting paid millions. Yes, the financial difference is undeniable, but the mental thoughts behind the setup of the teams, behind the way the world treats players versus owners, and the opportunities that are provided for them to become owners, or I should say not provided for them to become owners, the roadblocks that are placed up, that is all very similar. So this chapter just really made me dig into personally how I feel about those things. But there was so much in this one little short chapter that we could talk about it forever.
Yep.
And I'm sure we'll get into it. The microaggressions was huge for me because that's my life experience on a daily, especially in the workplace. So I'm sure we'll get into that discussion. So I don't want to be all over the place. But again, I just wanted to reiterate how much this book has challenged me. And so, again, I would encourage anybody listening to this podcast to pick that book up, read it, listen to it on Audible, something, because it will make you think. Absolutely.
So let's go ahead.
So, I wanted to just go back to something you said, Melissa, about the race being a social construct, and the beginning of this. Now that we've done the mapping of our DNA, we know we're 99.9% alike. Facial differences, skin tone is that 1% difference. But and like you, I grew up probably, and until probably the release of this information, probably a lot of us grew up thinking that, well, Black people had certain attributes, Asians, and all of a sudden now that's just thrown out the window. But what he said in the book, as I'm reading it, and I'm like tossing this around in my head, made sense because it took me back to, I used to be a trainer in the Department of Mental Health, bringing forward cultural competency. And one of the things, we talked about was the diversity was really around culture and ethnicity.
Right.
So, for example, the idea that, let's say, a Black person may, and it made sense to me because I traced my own DNA. And so when I got the record, they said, oh, you got the body of a runner. And I mean, they described my attributes. And as I think about this, think about evolution. So we all start off the same, but there's the evolution of where our cultures end up. So the evolution of people in Africa is going to be very different than the evolution of people in Europe.
Of course.
The evolution of people coming from Africa being enslaved is going to be very different than so in some ways, some of these maybe attributes that we have is about evolution, right, about culture and ethnicity, not so much we're different, biologically. But I agree with you about the aspect of exploitation.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And that in some ways, we've just evolved. It's still entertainment, and you still don't get to be at the table.
Yeah. Well,
yep. And it's important to point out that even like those differences, I think that's the part people miss, is that because it is cultural and not based on race, because people don't understand that race is solely about color. Mm-hmm. It's solely about you're white, I'm Black. But within the Black community, you're going to have people who are not physically, better. Okay. You're going to have some who are, and it takes away the opportunity, if you buy into that, the understanding that I can be intellectually superior.
Exactly.
I can be, it's not just physical, it's not just biological. And if you, I mean, it seems so simple that when you say it out loud, you just feel like, duh, like, do I really have to say this? But we do, because it's been drilled into us so long. But nobody's a monolith. No race, no group, no gender, nothing. So to keep trying to pin it on, to find a reason, to try to justify why it is this way, if we don't dig into exactly what you said, Henri, the culture, the location, the history, we have to look at all of that to understand humans, regardless of their race, regardless of their location. It's the human experience, and it's always going to be different. Always.
And you make me think. So I just watched on PBS, they had this 2-part special, The Black Church. I strongly recommend that to be watched. But it talked about the whole process of enslavement and how the importance of the Black church became to, Black culture. But there was something someone said in there, and they said the mistake was thinking that, these enslaved Africans was a tabula rasa, meaning we came to America with nothing. We had culture.
Absolutely.
We had history. We had language.
Yep. It's that saying that slavery didn't, I'm trying to remember the exact quote, but it's like, African-American history did not start with slavery. Slavery interrupted African-American history. Like, it was you didn't bring, there's so many quotes I've read, you didn't bring slaves to America. You brought doctors, scientists, homemakers, creatives, you brought people. So with those people came their cultures, came their skills, came their beliefs and their ideas. And there was a concentrated and deliberate effort to strip them of that, to demonize that, especially when it comes to religion. That's a whole nother series of podcasts that we could discuss. But it's a very valid point that you brought people here with their own lives and stories and histories, and Nothing drove that home for me more. I don't know if you guys ever saw it, but 12 Years a Slave,
Yeah.
the movie,
Yeah.
where they captured this and tricked him into being captured, this brilliant musician.
Right.
And
Read the book, it's even better.
you know what? The movie tore me up so much. I won't lie to you guys. I was in the theater alone, sitting in front of an elderly white couple. And I cried so hard in that movie that the lady reached up and just kept rubbing my back
Oh,
and patting my back. Oh,
Yeah.
and she kept saying, "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." So yeah, it was people. It was people, and we don't think of that. We don't realize that or remember that. And until we do, we're never going to get it right.
yeah.
Well, you know, and thinking about the enslavement process, and one of the things he talks about in the book, is, and it challenged some of my thinking, this idea of, and some people believe this, Black people sold their own people into slavery. And if you think about this, that there is diversity within the Black population, they weren't selling their own people. They were just selling, that's another tribe who speaks a different language that we captured. No different than what they did in Europe or any other country, But yet somehow that story has evolved to where some people think, Blacks against Blacks. Yeah, you sold your own. No, that's not exactly what happened.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I'm going to bring us to some of the terminology, because I want to make sure that we're very clear about it for our listeners who, aren't necessarily reading alongside of us. So when we're talking about this idea of biology, and you guys have said so much, I'm really trying to resist commenting on all of it because I know we have a limited amount of time, and so I'm just going to let it be what it is. So when we talk about biology, he defines it this way: biological racist is someone who's expressing the idea that the races are meaningfully different in their biology, and that these differences create a hierarchy of value. And that second piece is really important, because the buying into the belief that we're different biologically is what sets us up for the power conversation around, if we're different biologically, then we can rank the races, right? And that of course leads us to where we are. And so of course, just as he does consistently, biological anti-racist is someone who's expressing the idea that the races are meaningfully the same in their biology, and there are no genetic racial differences, which, Henri, you've already kind of fast forwarded to that part where the science is there, right? Now, frighteningly enough, 2000, it was as recent as 2000 that science, the mapping of the genome that you referenced, Henri, occurred, and that unequivocally, right, the scientific research shows that 99.9%, and as you said, the 1% is, it's skin tone, it's shape of, it's eye color, it's not a racially based difference. And we'll talk in a little while about how there's still, of course, plenty of those folks out there who are trying to assert, well, that 0.1% must be about race. So that's how he defines it. But Melissa, I'm going to take you to, I'm not surprised that you grabbed a hold of microaggression, because you've used that term before. And I definitely want to hear, because he takes that term, and for the listeners, very briefly, I'll share, he's telling a story about being in a third grade classroom with mostly brown kids and a white teacher with 3 white kids. And the very long story short is he has this memory of this moment in time where he kind of recognizes his own Blackness as a result of the actions of the white teacher, who essentially overlooks a very shy, quiet brown girl who is attempting to answer a question, and selects, which is a consistent behavior of this teacher, one of the 3 white kids to respond. And he sees the impact on this girl in his class, and it incites an anger in him that leads him kind of through this experience. But that story is important to the use of the word microaggression, because he jumps into that term, which is kind of interesting, because on some level it's almost like very separate from the rest of what he talks about in the chapter, and yet eventually you see how it's laced through. But he jumps on that term, Melissa, because we define microaggression as kind of the small, and not even necessarily small, but the consistent ways that we go through the day doing things that are an affront to someone else. And he gives examples like the white woman who grabs her purse when a black person sits next to her, the seat next to a black person stays empty on a bus. A white woman calls the cops because I'm walking my dog in Central Park, for example, right? But he actually ends up turning on that word a little bit. Do you remember that, Melissa? Do you want to talk about that?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely. And that's the reason I started off what I had to say with the fact that this man challenges the crap out of me. Because I never really, so he says that microaggressions, that the term is used because the actions are deemed minor.
Right.
So they're minor aggressions. I never use the word with that thought in mind. My thoughts on microaggressions are that they are it was more about intention in my definition, my mental understanding of the word was more about intention. And I used it along the lines of people doing things that they were not, or I don't want to say always, but in most part, were not aware of the fact that they were doing it. I think I based that more on my personal experience than what microaggressions might have meant as a whole, as a collective.
Sure.
For me, that word hits home because I deal with it so much in my professional life, and have for most of my professional life. My previous position, I would get those kinds of comments about my hair, which I alluded to in the previous podcast. I had locks for a great number of years, very long locks that probably reached my behind, and wore them in cute creative styles, but I would still be told things like, you really think that's gonna work in front of this commander? Do you think that's gonna look okay in front? And so it comes off as a very innocent gesture, comment, action, when in fact, everything behind it is steeped in racism, or at least racist ideas. And so for me, that's how I defined it, as kind of these little innocent intentions with a whole slew of ignorance behind it.
Yeah.
One of the ones I deal with in my current position so often is the angry Black woman trope. The minute I question anything, I get, oh, don't be upset. Nothing about my demeanor, my voice, my face, nothing is angry, nothing. But the minute I question something, or even try to explain something I've done and the reason I've done it, that's what I get. Well, I'm not coming down on you. Don't be upset. No, I don't think you're coming down on me, but I think that I have the right to defend my actions or explain my actions or whatever you want to call it. But after listening to him, I was like, yeah, it's not always innocent. It's not a little small thing. It's racism.
Yeah.
And we have to call it what it is. And I think that's one of the things that, if you go back to this very first, the opening of this book, this was the discussion Henri and I had around the word racism, very much so, is that it can be splitting hairs, it can be misunderstanding, it can be semantics, but the core of all of it, wherever it's coming from, whoever it's coming from, the core of it is these racist ideas and policies and history and beliefs that we all carry, which shape and form our actions, thoughts, beliefs, and opinions to this very day. Yeah. So it definitely challenged me. You'll probably hear me using that word much less.
Yeah.
And the times that I use it will probably be more out of habit than conscious thought. But yeah, it really made me look at that and say, I won't continue to soften, because that's what it does.
That's exactly it. That was his message. Yep.
Yeah, it softens what is actually happening, and I won't be a party to that anymore. So I appreciate it.
He says really specifically, a persistent daily low hum of racist abuse is not minor.
Exactly.
And that, like you said, I'm very familiar with that word. That word is used a lot. And I just thought, wow, a persistent low hum of. And so that's why he uses the term racist abuse, not microaggression.
Yeah, when I first started getting into social justice, especially, you know, online and things like that, I thought I was so progressive because I had made this distinction in my head that not everybody is racist. Some people are just racially insensitive. Like I literally,
Yeah.
I coined that. That was my thing. Like if you're racially insensitive, we just need to kind of educate you on it. And what I found is you're that way because you're choosing to be, because you're not trying to actively be anti-racist. Like
Yeah.
you're just going with the flow. And so that's why that resonated with me so much, because this is the same thing. Racism is racism is racist.
Yeah.
I don't care if it's
Yeah.
soft racism, hard racism, conscious, unconscious, it's racism. And
Yeah.
we have to call it what it is. Yeah.
You know, yeah, interesting topic. I just thought about this quote, sincere ignorance or conscientious stupidity, Martin Luther King. And I guess I was talking to someone earlier today, and she went to a seminar, an inclusion diversity seminar, and came away and felt it was one of the best she ever went to. And I asked her about it, and she said, you know, what was so different is, you know, I'm tired of being grouped in that group of all white people.
Okay.
And you know, and I guess, you know, this conversation for a moment makes me think about that, you know, because he makes reference to that, you know, the idea that all blacks, all whites, you know,
Yeah.
you know, well, she acted like that because she's white. Well, no, she acted like that because she's racist,
Yeah.
you know, and so I think, you know, for me, it's over time making this conscious decision that I can't group everybody, paint everybody with the same brush.
Yeah.
Because we know that's not true. We wouldn't be here if that was true, meaning as far along as we've gotten. You know, this whole issue about microaggressions is really interesting to me, because I kind of remember when it came about, and I remember reading articles about this. And what I found most interesting was they were calling what I would have called, well, that's just racist comments.
Yeah.
You know, now all of a sudden we found, and I think he makes a reference in the book, it's made it easier for people to talk about it.
Yes.
You know, we don't have to call it racist remarks now. We can call it microaggressions, you know, versus racist abuse.
Yeah.
You know, which was, I think that's the term he used, you know, and I mean, I will give someone the benefit of the doubt, you know, sincere ignorance. But once I've given you feedback and you continue, then you choose to be, and you choose. That's a choice you have made, to be racist or to inflict racial abusive comments to me or others, you know.
And Henri, just to jump on really quick about what you just said, I think the reason for that is, to use my own example, hearing someone say, "Oh, don't get upset." There's nothing in that that's race that is overtly racist. So it does not sound like a racist comment. Right. So it's a little harder to distinguish it as racism, because people don't understand that it's the history behind it, it's the stereotype behind it, it's the years of being labeled that without justification behind it. So it was easier to label those things microaggressions versus, don't be so angry. Black women are so angry. Now, if had someone said that, absolutely that's racist.
Right.
But to have someone just tell you repeatedly not to be angry when you're not angry doesn't necessarily point, at least, you know, for others to see, hear, understand, doesn't scream racism. So I think that's why it was so easy to do that. But you are 100% correct in the fact that that's just what it is.
So when we
well, one of the things he did, I'm sorry, and now I'll get out right off of it. So one of the things he talks about in the book is having dialogues with students,
Yes.
challenging these things. Because
Exactly.
as I'm listening to you, Melissa, I'm thinking, if I was in that situation, and in a very accommodating, delicate way, my question would be, what is it about what I'm asking or saying
Yes.
that,
Been there,
you
done
know,
that.
yeah, because at some point, I need to convey to you, I'm finding this offensive.
Yeah. And I like that way you just put it. And that's exactly, Audrey, you were right there with me, because as you were talking, Melissa, I was thinking about in my professional work, we do a lot of work with building effective teams. And we use Roger Schwartz's work. And part of his work is about this idea of assumptions and understanding where they come from, right? And so he talks about a ladder of inference. And the idea is that somebody has said what you indicated they said, and you start the questioning sequence of, so tell me what it is about what I said or did, or why do you think I'm upset, right? But as a way to dig into and get into like, okay, you got to flesh this out because I'm not upset and you think I am. So let's figure out where that comes from.
I really want to, because I absolutely agree, but I want us to also understand the dynamics of power involved in that.
Absolutely.
Because for an employee, which these are comments coming from management. So for an employee who, and I'm a living, breathing example, I promise you, did that.
Yeah.
So every time, if I repeatedly do it, so now Melissa's labeled as difficult to communicate with at work.
Yeah.
Every performance evaluation I have received in the last 3 years has said that I don't take feedback well.
Okay.
Simply because each time that I'm given such said feedback, I ask, why do you think I'm angry?
Right.
Why do you think I'm not? Every customer I've dealt with is satisfied. Why do you think I'm not? Then I'm becoming combative with my manager. Then I'm becoming insubordinate. Then, so there's so many layers and levels to that. While the conversation can happen between people who are willing to hear it, it cannot work with people who refuse to hear it or who refuse to accept that just maybe they're doing something wrong. So I just want us to keep in mind that power that we discussed in the last episode plays out in every single scenario that exists.
So what's so important about that, Melissa? I appreciate that you pointed that out, like the difference of when you feel like you can and can't have those types of conversations. But the thing I'll throw out there about your workplace example is it's such a powerful place for people to really reflect on their, like so many organizations and groups, et cetera, are doing cultural relevance trainings right now. They're doing unconscious bias trainings, et cetera. That's the work we need done, right there. Absolutely. That's the work we need done. What do your evaluations of your employees say about you as a leader, right? How can you take that data and translate it? And is it common, for example, for African-American women in your organization to have that kind of feedback? And if that is, that's where we need to do the training, right?
Absolutely.
Really kind of targeted and specific. And I don't want to get too far off track, but yeah.
But I listened to a fascinating discussion on PBS this week, and that scenario you talk about, Melissa, they describe as trauma and racial trauma that people of color continue to experience.
Absolutely.
And they talked about the effects it has on you biologically, psychologically, emotionally, and it's constant and it's daily. But what they also wanted to emphasize that, because I've been there where I felt I didn't have any power, but they want you to not feel powerless. I may not have any power, but I am not powerless.
I absolutely get that. Yeah.
And I need to find the joy in my life and the places where I can affect, some power or control over my life. You know what I mean? Because once you fall into that powerlessness, you're done.
Yeah, and that's partly why I'm here, Henri, to be honest with you. That's why this podcast is so important to me, because it gives me a voice to be able to talk about these kinds of things without that fear of repercussion, without that fear of retaliation. And it gives me that sense that I am, in a sense, giving back and helping other people who may be in this situation on either side, the person saying such things, thinking such things, or the person in the position to have to hear and deal with such things. So I absolutely agree with that. And I'm not advocating, by bringing up the power, I'm not advocating
of
for
course.
people to be silent.
Oh, no.
Speak up.
No,
I
of
still
course.
do it. Despite the bad reviews, I'll never stop, because that's that's what it should be. I just don't want us to forget. And by when I say us, I don't mean the three of us. I feel like the
No,
three of us
collectively.
understand that.
Yeah.
But those listening, I don't want people to forget that it's not always as easy as speaking up,
Of
because
course.
that comes with consequences as well.
But what's important about the fact that you point that out, Melissa, is that that's really important for somebody who might be listening to this, who says, well, why doesn't she just speak up?
Exactly.
Right. So you're
Correct
helping foster their understanding of it. Like you said, it's not as simple as that. And Henri, I know you were going to jump in, and then I'm going to bring us back, because I want us to explore a little bit more about his history piece. Go ahead.
Well, I just want to emphasize that piece of not feeling powerless,
Yes.
and and everyone's situation is different in terms of what your options are. I really understand that sense of power differentials, and having been there and frustrated and actually left jobs because of that.
Yep.
But I felt it was so important, and I think my dad instilled this in me, is never feel powerless. And so I then strove to be, how do I then become the director, where then I make policies and set the culture and the tone. People don't have to feel the way I feel.
Yeah. Yep.
And it depends on your circumstance and situation, but whatever you find to do, so you don't fall into that trap of feeling powerless or not finding joy, because that continued abuse is trauma.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate that you're introducing that that term, and I don't know where the source is, but I read something recently, and I've been reading a lot of different things, but that use that exact expression, racial trauma. And I think that's a really important, again, we're talking about with Kendi, how much words matter. And that's another one that matters. So I want to take us to the, I want to take us, because he gives us a two kind of pronged example of how historically we have justified looking at race as a biological component, right? And he kind of goes back to, this part really grabbed me, so I want to share it, but he goes back to that third grade classroom, and he talks about looking around the room and noting the differences between he and his fellow brown kids in the classroom, their skin, the nature of their hair, the shape of their noses, etc. And likewise, the contrast to the white kids in the classroom. And he talks about how, the essence of biological racism, or anti-racism rather, is that that we have to teach kids that those differences are meaningless. And of course, in his experience, nobody taught him that. So the translation is that we are different, right? And that is fundamentally like a part of our biology, that we are different, and no one taught him different. And that a biological anti-racist stance is to do exactly that. So he talks about the history of science, and the science that has been used for hundreds of years to prove, quote unquote, that races are biologically different, which of course have been disproved as of, the mapping of the genome that you mentioned, Henri, back in 2000. But he also talks about the religious piece, right? How we have used the Bible as a tool for hundreds and thousands of years to justify treating certain groups of people differently. And so really quickly, I'm going to land on a couple of these things, and then I want to get your thinking and your responses. But I think the science piece that really I understood, like I knew generally the history of using science as a way to explain differences in races, et cetera. Like I had that basic understanding, but he gave an example, and this one just made me so angry. I said to you guys before we started the episode, this chapter made me so angry when I came to realize how just almost casually, in some ways, we have fortified these myths, if you will, over time. But the example he gave that made me, I think, the most angry, because it was so recent, was in 1990, I think. No, end of the 80s. So 1988, at a American Heart Association conference, and a doctor doing a talk on why hypertension is higher in African Americans. And the doctor used the plausible explanation for this that he used came from watching the movie Roots. And what he argued is that African Americans had higher hypertension rates because only those able to retain high levels of salt survived consuming the salt water of the Atlantic Ocean during crossings. And I was like, I wanted to throw the book across the room. I just couldn't believe it. And this idea then, and this is one of the themes that he points out, is that we find truth any way we can to support and the truth is in quotes there, to support the truth that we want people to understand. And so a group of highly educated doctors sat in a room together and said, yep, that sounds about right. Okay, that's plausible. Right. And so it was, versus doing the hard work of actually getting to the root cause of why African American people have higher hypertension. Right. So that was the biological side. And then the religious side was a couple of different things, but he introduced me to a term I didn't know, and that is polygenesis. This idea that that we as a humankind actually evolved from 3 different men, not just Adam. And again, using that thinking as a line of support for then why it's okay to treat whites different from blacks, different from, Asians, etc. So I know you both read the same thing. So wherever you want to dig a little deeper or take that is up to you. Henri, you want to tell us what you're thinking?
Well, no, I remember touching on that at the end of the last discussion, this idea that this salt from the sea somehow empowered you.
Wow.
I mean, how ridiculous is that? Yeah. But you're right. I mean, the idea of coming up with these ideas, and it's not unique. I mean, we see it in the medical field, so my degree is in public health. There's tons of research that shows Black people experience pain differently, so we can medicate them differently.
Yep.
What a bunch of nonsense. That's not based on anything biological. It's based on some racist belief that you may have a bigger propensity towards addiction.
Yeah.
Well, we know data that shows that's not true also.
Of course.
But yet, these things have become so embedded that, when you encounter these agencies, these institutions, this is what happens.
Yeah.
And if you don't challenge it, you are going to be harmed or compromised.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right.
And Henri, that really it drives home for me the fact that we don't know history. We don't know, study, or understand history, because if we did, we would clearly understand that there's documented cases, proven fact, that many of for example, gynecology, many of the doctors of gynecology back in the day believed that Black women felt no pain, and therefore used Black women to test theories and surgical practices without anesthesia, which gives us the information we have today about how the female body works and what it needs. But that when dealing with doctors today, Black women still get treated differently. Black women still get medications less. We still have to fight harder and advocate for our health harder than any other group. And we die in childbirth more than any other group of women. Because believe it or not, as much as people don't want to think it's still going on today, those mindsets still prevail that Black women somehow feel no pain or less pain than other women, and Blacks in general over other people. It's the history that we are missing. We are not studying it. We are not learning it. We don't know it. I'm not even going to delve into it deeply. I'm just going to throw out there for anybody listening to research Henrietta Lack. And there's proof right there of all of it.
Yeah.
But, anecdotally, we know, and, we've talked about doing some of these things on healthcare. The best predictor for getting compromised healthcare has nothing to do with insurance,
Exactly.
versus, the color of your skin when you walk in for services. You know, and it shouldn't be like that. But yet, as I'm saying, this is so embedded, and anecdotally, just for myself, I've even tested this out. And I, have actually made choices around the doctors that are in my network of care that have led to, I will travel certain distances to be engaged with doctors that I truly feel sincerely think of me as a person.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, I've had the both experiences, and in fact, I remember I actually filed complaints, on people because I went in for medical services and they literally did not treat me appropriately. But, again, these are decisions you have to make as an individual. But yeah, it is so embedded, this whole idea of difference. I mean, he talked about going back to the book and these three different populations. I think it was the white man, the Asian, and the black man, and how talking about in the evolutionary process, the white man will excel and the other two will either assimilate or become obsolete. Yeah. I mean, where do you come up with this stuff?
Well, and he even explains, over the 400-year period of time where this idea of polygenesis was embraced, right? So we came from three different, not just Adam, but three different, and therefore we can be different. We can treat races differently. He talks about, and I'm looking over here at my notes really quickly, that with those three lines that you just mentioned, that essentially, some Darwinist theory is based on this idea that there are three outcomes for the weaker races, because again, by buying into this biological mirage, right, that he calls it, you then say, okay, because of that, we can rank them, right? If they're different, we can rank them. And of course, ranking puts whites at the top. But the outcomes for the three races that he says are extinction, which he argues we worked really hard to make happen for Native Americans. And by the way, that idea of polygenesis really was embraced when Columbus got here, because, okay, now we have this whole different quote unquote race of people. And so the idea was you have three outcomes. You have extinction, you have slavery, which of course our history shows how we embrace that idea for African Americans. And like you said, Henri, or assimilation, which of course brings us back to what we talked about last week about this idea around assimilation. And again, an assimilationist view is there is a weaker race, but we can make them better, right? And so kind of trying to hammer through this idea that if that is your thought, that's racist, right? And I do love, by the way, that at some point he says, the people who shy away from the R word are racist. And of course, he also argues we all are, right? Like we all have to intentionally think about and deliberately choose differently, because the messaging we get is so strong from birth. And he says that he takes that right back to his third grade self. Like I said, when he sits there and he describes understanding the differences between the white kids in the room and himself and the other brown kids in the room, and believing at that point that they're fundamentally biologically different because nobody has taught him otherwise. So yes, all of those things tie together, and to realize like, okay, those are, if we're going to rank them, those are the only three outcomes that could come from it. And again, flashing all the way back forward to, it wasn't until 2000 that we mapped the genome, right? That it wasn't until 2000 that all the things we just talked about, the American Heart Association example, the other examples that you just talked about, et cetera, are debunked, right? Like finally, it's not that we, quote unquote, didn't know, but certainly scientifically debunked. And then he goes on to talk about how even since then, right, you have your people holding on to, Melissa, I think you said this in the beginning of the conversation. Well, it's only 99.9%. So 0.1% is different. And that has to be racial. And he brings up the idea of, I'm trying to remember who it was. And again, going back to the history piece, as you said, Melissa, So we grabbed onto this idea that, okay, well, there's a behavioral component to that. And so if we can't say that you're biologically different, we can say that that 0.1% is tied to behavior. And now we can use that as a foundation, if you will, for the racist policies, et cetera. So those are some of the things that, from a historical perspective, I wanted to make sure that we surface, because you said it right, Melissa. We don't know the history in this way. That's why I was angry, because when I understood it at this level, it's so much harder to think about. Go ahead, Henri.
But the behavioral component really touches on this aspect of there's more diversity within than without.
Yeah.
Because if you look at any ethnicity, any population, just to use this word, they all had gangs.
Yeah.
I mean, white people, Asian people, black.
That's exactly right.
There was always someone within that, let's call it that group, that culture, that did something wrong. That doesn't mean you paint everybody with the same brush.
Absolutely.
So this idea of behavioral components is nonsense.
Of course.
Yeah. And like I think we said a little earlier, you're not racist because you're white. Well, she's you're racist because you're racist.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, I like that. That's a really great way to put it. So he goes on, and I'm bringing us kind of toward the end of the chapter now, and we're getting toward the end of our time. So be thinking about your final things. But the thing I think that he finally points out that's really important. So one of my takeaways, right, until I got to page 54 was, I'm never gonna indicate my race on a form again, ever. Like, I'm not doing it. But then, darn it, he says, assimilationists believe in the post-racial myth that talking about race constitutes racism. We talked about that. And that if we stop identifying by race, then racism will miraculously go away. Now, I wasn't thinking stop indicating it because it would make racism go away. I was thinking it because it made me angry now that it's even on a form. But he actually points out, here's the key. We have to continue to identify racially. And he says, because if we can't identify racial inequity, if we stop identifying racially, then we can't identify racial inequities. And if we can't do that, then we won't be able to identify racist policies. And if we can't do that, then we can't challenge racist policies. And if we can't do that, then racist power's final solution will be achieved, a world of inequity that we don't even see. So again, he kind of made me go, oh, you're right. Okay, we actually have to identify by race even more right now. And he actually says that terminating racial categories is potentially the last, but not the first step in the anti-racist struggle. And I was like, okay, yep, I get that. That makes a lot of sense to me. That for now, it has to be actually on the forefront for us to really continue to be able to identify the inequities that lead to all the other things. What do you guys think?
It's that idea, and I heard it so much over and over again, especially in the last presidential administration. If we would just stop talking about it, why does race always have to be included in everything? If you would just stop talking about it, it would go away. And I'm with you, Janice. That's why I say, welcome to my world. He will make you question your decision and flip it several times in a matter of minutes. But I agree completely that for now, we have to continue to talk about it, because you can't challenge it unless you do. If you just be quiet about it, it's not going to go away. That's the case with anything. And we know that. We know that in every other area. We tell sexual abuse victims to speak up. We tell domestic violence victims to speak up. We tell anybody that might be the victim of something, traumatized by something, to speak up. But yet, whenever it comes to this subject, which is just as traumatizing, just as abusive, just as hurtful, we say, don't talk about that. Just leave that alone. And that's not the answer.
Yeah. Henri, you're nodding your head.
Well, it makes me think we have what I'll call a move on society.
Yes.
Where we literally like to move on and have short memories of things, and we can't just move on. And this is, and again, my background being public health, this is really a dilemma I had professionally and personally.
Yeah.
You know, because on one level, you know, I've thought about the pursuit of when can we get away from this? But like he's saying, you can't get away from it because you need the categories in the research to really flush out where are the gaps, where are the things that are not happening, where are the services not getting to the various populations. So it's sort of something we have to live with as we move forward to try to undo. And maybe one day we'll get there. And like you, Janice, one of the things I've started to do is, you know, on forums, you know, when they ask for my race and ethnicity, I go back and forth. You know, some days I say nothing. You know, there's a box you can choose to decline. And sometimes I don't. And I think about where is the research going? Because if my declining means it's not going to get to what we're talking about, looking at the disparity between me being Black versus someone being white, then I'm not being helpful. You know, so, you know, it's something you have to really challenge yourself with and think about, you know, ongoingly, that it's just not to say this black and white.
And I would like to add really quickly, Andrea, based on what you said, that I agree that we have a move on society, but I also want to point out that move on is very selective. We don't want to move on from some things, but we are intent on moving on from others. For example, we still haven't moved on from the Confederacy. We still see flags being flown. We still see Confederate reenactments. I'm from Spotsylvania.
Statues.
Yeah, I'm from Spotsylvania, Virginia, where one of the battles took place, and right across from my sister's home, every single year, like clockwork, there's a full week of reenactments with people in uniforms with guns reenacting the battle. We don't move on from 9/11. We want people to remember that every year, but we want people to forget about the Tulsa riots. We want people to forget about Black Wall Street. And it's not a coincidence that the things we want to move on from are centered around the treatment of Black people and Native people in this country. We want to forget about the Trail of Tears, but we certainly don't want to forget about any of the stuff that puts America in a great light, so they see. So I absolutely agree that we have that move on mentality selectively.
Yeah, very selectively.
And just to maybe wrap this up a bit, because, you know, one of the things that, you know, I started talking about the sum of us in that book, and I think one of the things that maybe that can be woven into this discussion is racism hurts white people.
Yes.
Yep. You know, and if somehow, and until they understand that and get that, this is going to continue. You know, you know, you might think you're hurting us, but you are also hurting yourselves and a lot of other people at the same time.
Well, and it's hard to consider that that could be the thing. Like, okay, coming to an understanding that racism hurts me as a white person. Oh, now I need to pay attention and I need to figure out what this is and how I stop it. And I guess, you know, that's whatever the motivation is, if in the end it makes a dent on the, you know, or increases the presence of anti-racist thinking, as Kendi would say, then I guess that's a good thing. But it's a little mind-boggling to consider that might have to be the angle. So let me bring us back to the biological piece for him so that we can wrap this piece up from the perspective of, if you are, you know, as a listener, right, and if you've never dug deeply into the research and the thinking behind the mirages around biological differences that we know now to be biological mirages, he says this to help us wrap it up. Biological equality, okay, to be anti-racist rather, is to recognize the reality of biological equality, which we know scientifically has been proven, that skin color is as meaningless to our underlying humanity as the clothes we wear over that skin. To be anti-racist, and this is going to lead to us sharing a couple of actions that our listeners could take to build off of their learning today. To be anti-racist is to recognize that there's no such thing as white blood or black diseases or natural Latinx athleticism. To be anti-racist is to also recognize the living, breathing reality of this racial mirage we've been talking about, which makes our skin colors more meaningful than our individuality. To be anti-racist is to focus on ending the racism that shapes the mirages, not to ignore the mirages that shape people's lives. And I think that's a really important thing for our listeners to consider. So we said each week we're going to work really hard to share some actions that you can take, right? Because we don't want you to just listen. We want you to listen and do something in order to ensure that this is learning that we're all taking someplace. So I'm going to share a couple that I thought of, and then Henri and Melissa, I'm going to give it to you for final word. That could be another action. It could be something you want listeners to think about as a result of the episode. So I thought about 3 quick examples: small, medium, and large, right? So what's something small that you could do? Something small you could do is a reflection, right? What biological racist ideas, now that you understand them in the way we've been talking about, have you understood and believed over your lifetime, right? Some of the same kind of examples that Melissa and Henri offered us. What are some of the ones did we say something that kind of resonated with you because you're like, yeah, I always thought that was true, right? I always thought Black people were better athletes because look at the number of, Black athletes on a football field, like Melissa said earlier, for example. How do you begin to retrain your own brain then about them now? Just hearing us talk about it once isn't the answer. You have to actually be deliberate about it. In fact, in a different book, Happiness Advantage, Sean Aker, who's a sociologist, explores how we can retrain our brains, and that can be done, right? But you have to be deliberate. So you have to both recognize those misconceptions that you've walked around with and begin to retrain your own brain to deliberately think differently about them. Something medium could be, and it takes a little bit more courage, right, is to have a conversation with one friend about an idea or the idea of biological racism that we talked about today, and what you understand now, an aha maybe that came from it. You hear us revealing our ahas as we talk. So what's something that you heard that makes you kind of go, oh, wow, I really have to rethink that. Take the step to talk to somebody else about that. And then lastly, a larger scale, right? Again, takes more intent, it takes more effort, et cetera, would be to attend or at least review the minutes from a local town council meeting, right? Look at the business of that group through an anti-racist lens. Again, this is a broader way of thinking about an action item, and see what you see and just reflect on that. So I'm going to go first to Henri and then final to Melissa. Final thought, thing you want them to think about, action you want to add to the list. Henri, what are you thinking?
No, so I'll ditto everything you said. So one thought I'd like to end with. So I'm a scientist, and I know when I talk to people about this, a lot of people think of this as social science.
Okay.
And social science isn't quantifiable, and so in some ways it doesn't make it real to people.
Yeah.
And I just was so moved by, and I implore people to go listen to the podcast, and if they can, to actually read the book, Some of Us.
Yeah.
Because I think once you can look at quantifiable data that can clearly show these disparities that we're talking about that have actually manifested in terms of policy and differences and changes that have been sustained, maybe that'll help people to kind of become more informed.
Yeah. Appreciate that.
Move away from the sincere ignorance.
Henri might be identifying the next book we explore together. We'll see. All right, Melissa, what you got?
I love the idea of a small, medium, and large action. So I have 3 really quick ones.
Yeah.
Small, I want to first say I applaud anybody listening to this podcast, whether this is your first time listening or whether you're someone who listens repeatedly. I want to applaud you because you're already taking a very small action simply by listening and being here. So my challenge to you is to share it with someone else and have discussions around it. Share it, discuss it. It could be with one person, it could be with multiple, it could be on a social media page, however. Just take the step to share it so that these discussions can reach more people and hopefully increase the perspectives that are included in it. The medium would be to expand your efforts by reading or listening. I mean, there's so many options today. If you don't have the time to sit down and actually pull out a book and read line by line, there's, programs like Audible through Amazon that has this very book. Is how I'm doing it. I'm not reading. I thought I would be, but I just don't have the time to read. So
Yeah.
I'm listening on Audible, and I can do that. I work from home, so I can do that as I work. I can do that as I run. I can do that as I, create something, whatever. So there's that option. But reading and getting even more information and knowledge is always something that we can do. We can choose to do. And we have said repeatedly that the choice is what makes progress happen.
Yeah.
The third and large thing would be something that is probably very uncomfortable for a lot of people if you're not as straightforward as Janice and Henri and I, but I would say challenge others. Even if you don't feel like you have all the facts, even if you don't feel like you are the foremost expert on a topic, because none of us are. But Janice and I had discussed in some past episodes before we were lucky enough to have Henri join us, that sometimes speaking up is what it takes. Even if there was some concern that, well, if I speak up and I don't have all the information, then I might just confirm someone's, thoughts. And that's always a possibility. But if a person's going to hold you saying, I don't know, but we can certainly find out together, or we can research it. If they're going to hold that against you, they were going to hold it against you anyway. Nobody's expected to have all the facts or all the information, but it's important that we stand up for others, even if it doesn't impact us directly, which is one of the failings of humanity, in my opinion, is that we don't care about things until it hurts us. And then once it hurts us, then we want everybody to be, as upset as we are. And I don't want it to be that way. I want us to be proactive in standing up for other people and fighting injustice and inequality every chance we get. So it could be something small that you stand up for someone about. You could go to a school meeting, whatever. Just be willing, at least, to take that step and stand up for someone else. So those would be my final words and my action thoughts. And again, just a huge thank you to everybody listening. We really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
So, you made me think. He talks in the book, the chapter where he talks about his friend Smurfers, and how there were many instances where he sat by and did nothing. And the way he tells that story, you can almost feel like he wished he didn't do that.
That's exactly right.
And I think we all have those moments where a moment will pass and we'll be like, oh, I could have said, or oh, I should have said, oh, I wish I had. And so knowing that, we have to make sure, I agree, that we don't have that regret, that we walk every moment doing the thing we know is the right thing to do.
That's it. So next week, you guys, we're going to continue to dig into how to be an anti-racist. We're going to go into looking at this through the lens of ethnicity, and he defines ethnic racism. So as a look ahead to next week, as a powerful collection of racist policies that lead to inequity between racialized ethnic groups and are substantiated by racist ideas about racialized ethnic groups. That's where we're going next week, everyone. You have your actions to take. Thank you, as Melissa said, and Henri, for being here. Thanks to both of you for sharing your thoughts and being so open and candid with all of us, because it's making a significant difference in the learning. Share, like, subscribe, do all the things, and we'll see you next week, and we'll get to it.